Hey, Sponsorship Nation, welcome to the inaugural episode of Deck Diagnosis, where we help great organizations make fantastic sponsorship decks. For episode number one, we have two really special guests. We have Layla Adnani and Kendall McCumber. I had the honor to be on their podcast, and so I feel that I'm returning the favor. Hey, guys, how you doing?
Good. How are you?
So good.
Awesome. Welcome to Deck Diagnosis.
Thank you. We appreciate the opportunity.
Awesome. Well, why don't you share with Sponsorship Nation all about Philanthropy United podcast, your company, Personalized Solutions. Tell us everything about your company.
So we started as Personalized Solutions 11 years ago. And what transformed into a lot of live event planning, branding, digital marketing, really with a more political focus in Washington, D.C. 11 years ago, transformed when I decided to move and pick up everything in pop-up shop in Scottsdale, Arizona. I was ready for a life change. I was ready for that better weather. And I decided that that was the time to leave the political stuff behind and really focus on things that feel good, which is nonprofit work. So Kendall and I met early on. I moved in 2018. We met in 2018, started working together on a charity event together in 2019. And after that, we both realized that, hey, we work really well together and there's a huge, huge market for being able to help nonprofits throw incredible live fundraising events. So fast forward, we get through the pandemic and we said, we haven't been able to talk to these nonprofits because all the events have just stopped, right? And how can we help them while still not having big events and having that same impact? So we created the Philanthropy United podcast. It launched on our 10-year business anniversary in 2021. And it's been fortunately a huge success. We've interviewed people from all over the world, nonprofit leaders, experts like yourself, and it's really been beneficial to our audience, which are people who are working in the nonprofit space and donors who want to learn about new ways to get involved. So fast forward, we split the business in half. Personalized Solutions focuses on our for-profit clientele, and then Philanthropy United is now its own agency dedicated to digital strategy and amazing, amazing fundraising events for nonprofits. So we have our podcast.
Right. And you've been featured on some pretty impressive publications, haven't you?
Thank you. Yes. We've been fortunate enough to be covered front page of the Washington Post business section, PBS, NPR, I forget who I'm missing on that list.
Front Doors.
Yes. Local publications, of course, here in Arizona. And yeah, so most recently we expanded our offerings to Dallas, Texas, which has been great. And, but anyways, what we're here for today is our podcast is now approaching season 3, which is so exciting. And we need to figure out how we can connect with sponsors because it's a really great opportunity. We've got a good market of people who are paying attention. And we'd connected with you as a guest and we said, maybe he can just sit here and rip this apart for us. And we can use it as a case study of here's what we started with. Here's what Genius Ken has helped us land with, and then let people know how effective it was. So that's why we're here today.
Wow. You're really good for my PR. Thank you.
I try.
Now, so tell me more before we kind of dig into your sponsorship deck. Tell me more. How has the show evolved? 3 seasons, a lot of shows don't make it out of season 1. And here you guys are in season 3. How has your show evolved and what have you learned? And what do you hope to get out of sponsorship in season 3?
Kendall, what would you say?
With some of the sponsorships, we hope it'll help us get some of those bigger nonprofits that they'll be starting to pay attention to us and the platform that we're trying to use, partially to just spread positivity, but then partially to connect donors that maybe live on the East Coast with a charity that has a cause that's near and dear to their heart, and it's located on the West Coast, or maybe it's even in Europe. And they're getting the opportunity to learn about all these different nonprofits that exist and how they can use their funds and contribute and make a better impact for the causes that mean something to them.
The other part too of the evolution from season 1 now into season 3 is we've had such a great showing of different types of nonprofits. And now in season 3, we're trying to be a lot more diligent of having categories, right? Because there's more than enough nonprofits that need a platform to share their story. As we move forward, we're looking for having a military month, nonprofits that are dedicated just to supporting those who've been in the armed forces or currently in the armed forces, or maybe of the fallen. And then having social issues, right? LGBTQ, all of that kind of stuff, having animal rights. We have really not featured much in that arena. So we would like to get more involved with that. And then
on the animal side, we have done a bunch of different types of animal shelters, but not anything as far as advocacy for them.
right. And then we've recorded a lot of them. We've had a huge month of, what would you say, like women's abuse? Like, I don't know what category that falls in.
Yeah, we've had a couple that were domestic violence. We've had a couple that are in the works for experts in certain fields of fundraising. We've had some where they were first responders, and they are a nonprofit that helps first responders, not specifically just military, could be police officers, firefighters.
So we're trying to format it to be a lot stronger, right? So people know that in the month of July, this is what you're getting. In August, this is what you're getting, and to create a little bit more structure around it. Whereas before in season 1 and 2, it was a mad dash of interviews, pushing out the content, and it was great content. We're super grateful for everybody who's been on those 2 seasons. But moving forward, we want to create something a little bit more. So if a sponsor says, hey, I align really, really so much with all the military nonprofits, that's the month that I want to be a sponsor for, then we're able to put them in for things that are of utmost importance to them as an organization.
That's awesome. And so I'm going to start the diagnosis right here and now. And one of the things that, based on what you're telling me, this is like a really beefy, substantial editorial calendar, right? If you intend to do kind of thematic months with certain nonprofits, it'd be great to include that calendar in your sponsorship deck, because there might be sponsors who align with certain topics. Or you mentioned animal rights and helping the military and veterans. And so there really could be like even sub niches that certain sponsors would align with. So having that editorial calendar would be really helpful.
Good idea. Definitely can do that once we've solidified it a little bit more. So that's the problem, right? If it's not completely solidified, how in depth do we need to go on that? Is it okay if it's still, a couple of charities within those months have not been filled yet, or do we need to have it completely done before we approach somebody?
Yeah, another kind of rule of thumb with sponsorship decks and sponsorship in general is once you promise it, it's set in stone.
Okay.
So pretty much it has to be complete before you put it out there for a sponsor.
Okay. Good to know.
Well, let's go ahead and let's look at your sponsorship deck. So we have here the Philanthropy United podcast sponsorship deck, season 3. And so before we go into specifics, let's talk about like what a sponsorship deck is used for. And then I think it'll give you guys some insights about whether or not your current document really serves that purpose.
Okay.
First of all, a deck is an introduction, right? What you're really doing is set the table for future conversations with a sponsor. You're not trying to close the deal, because in all my years of sponsorship, I've seen very few, if any, sponsorships that close on the back of a generic sponsorship deck. Mm-hmm. Usually there are conversations and exchanges back and forth before a sponsorship is closed. So really what you're doing is you're setting the table, opening the door, and you're really kind of prefacing what the next conversation is about. So really you're trying to get that attention, but you're not trying to make this document do everything that needs to be done.
All right. So the last page we've got to eliminate entirely.
Well, we'll get there. So now, as I open this up, there's a couple things to think in mind. One is I want to know immediately who you are and what you stand for.
Okay.
Right? Your brand, which your brand message is who you are. And the interesting thing about it is you have to balance a couple of considerations. Number one is most sponsors who receive unsolicited decks, if they open your email, if they open your envelope, however you send it, you have literally about 8 seconds to catch their attention. Not dissimilar to how people surf the web and look at different websites. It's about 8 seconds of attention. They determine relevance and off they go if it's not relevant. The other thing they're looking for is, while the deck is about you and your brand, they want to see as soon as possible, does this solve their problem? So whatever problem they have, it's reaching their audience, enhancing their brand, selling products or services, whatever's causing them pain and keeping them up at night, that's what they want to see. So here's the first page, right? I understand your brand is about positive podcasting. And I think this is a screenshot of an article about you guys. Is that correct?
Correct.
However, there's a lot of real estate you're using in this opening slide, right? We have to get attention. We have to talk about your brand, and we have to reference that there's a problem that this is going to solve for a sponsor. I'd focus on where you're looking at the bottom of this one, where you talk about your mission to help nonprofits tell their unique impact stories and expand their networks of donors, and then possibly add in a positive environment in a sea of negativity. So really what you want to do is get to your call to action fast, up front, up top, and talk about kind of what this podcast represents and why the sponsor should go to the next page.
Love it.
So as we move to the next, join us. This is typically a place where you're talking about your organization, you potentially the two of you, and what you stand for. And so again, look, here's the page. I'm all in favor of using visuals because many people are visual learners. The old adage of a picture tells the story of 1,000 words is true. And so you've used here a lot of real estate to show your photos, pictures of the two of you, which is great. But again, are there other imagery that could really tell the story of who you are and what you stand for as two podcast hosts?
Would this be a good opportunity to showcase some of our guests that we've had on the show?
Well, I think I'd get to that, and we're going to talk about that a little later in your deck. But I think if you are talking about the two of you, your name, for example, your name's not on here. You've given more focus on the Harvard Business Review than you have on Layla and Kendall, right? As the two of your hosts. So I would reconfigure this page, perhaps a little more imagery, but definitely focus on the two of you because the two of you are the podcast, right?
So as far as imagery, like more of like a photo collage.
Could be. It could be the two of you, and I know you use this later in your deck. It could be the two of you talking to a guest. It could be the two of you if you did a live shot, a show on location. It could be that. But whatever talks about the brand, your brand is basically positivity and nonprofits, right? Correct. So it's imagery that aligns with those two things.
All right.
So this is different. So today's episode of Deck Diagnosis, we're talking to a podcast. Podcast sponsorship is very close to traditional advertising. So there's this bright line, like, is this advertising? Is this sponsorship? The conversation you and I are about to have is a little different than I might have, for example, for a nonprofit that's looking for sponsorship. Because a nonprofit looking for sponsorship is purer sponsorship than a podcast, right? So what you're doing with this sponsorship is you're making it easy for a sponsor to buy, and sponsorship levels does that. However, typically in sponsorship, I advise strongly against sponsorship levels. The reason is, if you're talking to a sponsor and you're saying there's only 3 ways to participate in our property, in our show, it's like shopping for shoes on Zappos, except they only offer 3 sizes, right? Size 5, size 7, and size 13. That's it. You got to pick one of those sizes, whether you're a size 9 or not. We don't really care. Pick a size that may or may not be relevant to you. I don't really think that that's the case here. I think what you've done here is you're making it easy to buy from you guys. A couple things I'd mention. One is that usually with sponsorship levels, or sometimes people call it the investment page, those are usually in the back because you have to do the heavy lifting of persuading prior to giving people a reason to look at price. because basically by the end of it, if you've done an effective job on your deck, having pricing in the back is a formality, as opposed if you put it up front and someone looks at your presenting sponsorship, it's $1,000. Oh, whoa. That's too expensive for me. Close the page. So the other thing I'd mention on pricing, and we're here to talk about the deck, not necessarily the pricing. The one thing to keep in mind is, can a sponsor enjoy a return on investment from your podcast that will justify the investment they're making in you? So to think through kind of if they're going to sell goods and services, if they're enhancing their brand, does the pricing make sense from the sponsor's perspective?
Okay. So we would take this page and we would push it to the back, but you're okay with us having levels that are defined in this circumstance?
Yes. And again, like everything else we talked about with imagery, make the imagery relevant to the sponsorship level, or make the imagery relevant to your core brand, and ensure that with each picture that people can understand it, right? Because these are pictures without captions, so they've got to live on their own. So either they're related to the level or they're related strongly to you, and it's pretty obvious.
Got it.
Cool. So ad style options, I think this kind of falls into the category I saw later in page 7 of the deck. You talk about the contract, and we're gonna get into that. Remember that 8-second rule and how precious each moment is that the sponsor
Gotta
is
get rid of this entirely then.
Yeah, well, if there's a need to have it, have it. But if there isn't a need, what I recommend is just have it sit somewhere on your website.
Okay.
Right. And just at the tail end, go, if any questions about ad style options, click here. Especially with PDFs, you can make those live and clickable. And again, if you want to see the form contract that we use, click here. You don't have to use this valuable. You've used 2 pages of really your super valuable real estate to talk about things that aren't really persuading people that you guys are a brand worthy of investment. So that would be my recommendation on that page.
Got it.
On the presenting sponsorship page, I appreciate the fact that presenting is your top tier sponsorship level, and you really want people to see kind of what that's all about. That's kind of 6 of one, half dozen of another. I see people incorporating that in sponsorship decks. It could be helpful. I think this is a judgment call whether this goes on your website, as we talked about with the others, or whether presenting sponsorship level is so important that you really wanted to see people kind of visualize what this is all about. Okay. The other thing that I'd mention is to differentiate this from a pure advertising play, potentially add some assets and inventory to this that kind of make the sponsorship living, right? Kind of potentially incorporating some of their content into your show if it's relevant to nonprofits. What other things make sense versus you're just getting exposure on our show. I think kind of one kind of best practice that I see in other podcasts is they only incorporate brands for sponsors that they believe in or that are really intimately tied to their audience. So that gives, if that's the case, that gives you guys entree to really talk about them during your podcast, right? To
Absolutely
say, hey, I've shopped at Right Toyota. They are fantastic. I really appreciate what they do. Our listeners have gone there and have, et cetera, right?
Yes. And that is actually why we chose
that. Actually, one of our really big supporters.
Because their
great.
philanthropy director is incredible and partners with us on so many things that we felt that would be as an example of really solid one, because we already have such a good relationship with them.
Well, then when this episode comes out, send them the link to this episode that we gave them a shout out. All right. Now, this is the most important page. Cue music.
We have one of those.
Ta-da! Lights from heaven shine on this page. So basically, sponsors will only sponsor if your audience aligns with their customers. Right. So sometimes this is further up in the deck, right? Because again, that 8-second rule, we're trying to demonstrate very quickly that the sponsor will really align with your audience. And so I appreciate that the fact that, for example, you put in there that you've got 3,000 people taking down your podcast each week, which I tell you, you'd be surprised about how many podcasts and other places don't disclose that data, which is crazy. You need to, because the sponsor needs to understand the potential ambit of exposure that they get. But here's what I would love to see in this: your audience.
Okay.
Now, some podcast producers, some of the software, some of the hosting sites will provide you with demographic data. So let's talk about what that means. That is the gender, the age, where they live, potentially their occupation, right? Potentially their household income.
Mhm.
All of this, the demographics are the things that generally don't change about people.
Right.
Then there's the psychographics of it, what they value, their hobbies, what they do in their spare time. Again, you're leaving breadcrumbs for the sponsor that says that your audience are their customers. And then I've even seen both podcasts and properties include things like buying habits. They're in the market, like your auto dealership client would want to know, do you know whether your audience is in the market for a new or used car in the next 6 months?
So if we don't have that information at that level, what would you suggest?
Yeah, I'd say if you know generally, sometimes you have to back into that data. So, for example, if you know that basically your podcast is aimed at the executive directors of nonprofits, then you find via like the National Nonprofit Association, kind of what is the general demographics for executive directors of nonprofits of a certain size. Again, any way that you can back into it, even if it's more generalized and not specific to your podcast, you have to give a sense of who's listening in terms of demographic and psychographic. Otherwise, there is no sponsor that markets to Gen Pop or the general population, because with the exception of some of the larger consumer product companies, because it's too expensive.
For sure.
Right. That means I have to market everywhere to everyone all the time. So this is the place where you have to do as good a job as possible to talk about your audience.
Got
right?
it. We'll
The more
definitely
focused it is, the higher the likelihood you're going to get a sponsor is
Okay.
basically. So that's why I said, lights of heaven are upon this page. And then consider.
I've got a question for you still on this page. So because we're also with season 3 going back to adding video, would it be feasible and a good idea for us to add the YouTube demographics and information as well, or just like Spotify and that sort of thing? What
a great suggestion. And yes, so if to the extent that you can grab demographics off your social channel, or if you're using Google Analytics or another analytics platform as part of your website, your podcast website,
Mhm.
all of that will contribute. I would just label it, right? You don't want to morph it all together. You want to say, here's our YouTube channel demographics. Here's but yeah, absolutely. What a great suggestion.
Awesome.
So moving to page 7, we talked about having the contract, unless there's a specific reason to have this in there. Yeah. Move it to a link on your website. Love the picture. This is about a podcast. This is the two of you in podcast mode. Mm-hmm. It's fantastic.
We wanted to show that our show does get press, right? Because there's tons of podcasts out there, and we've been fortunate enough that, other publications have been like, hey, we want to spotlight this, which has definitely helped us grow that listener base.
Exactly. And we're going to get to that in a minute, because I think there's a big opportunity for you to kind of up the game on this deck with that kind of information. So the last thing I want to see, how do I get in touch with you guys?
Okay.
So again, more imagery. I don't know if I'd necessarily continue to focus on the two of you. I would focus on your audience. I'd focus on your podcast guests, or I'd focus on kind of the general subject matter. Because again, you want your sponsor to see themselves or the solution to their problem in your deck. And so if you over-index on things about you, it's tougher for the sponsor to see that you're the solution to their problem.
Got it. Love that.
Then the things that are not in the deck that I really want to see, you kind of touch on it. I'm looking right here at the bottom where you have the logos of the publications I think you guys have been featured in.
Yes.
There's something missing in the deck that I think could incorporate not only that, because that is called third-party validation, and that is the media saying that you're great, right? It's not you saying you're great.
Yeah.
Someone else is saying you're great. That's third-party validation. But there's something else that's missing that I think you guys could really benefit from. So in preparation for this, I went to Apple Podcasts and some of the other places where your podcast is available so that people can listen. And I saw your reviews. Fantastic reviews, right?
Aw.
People love your positivity. People loved kind of the great things you represent. People enjoyed the episodes. Put them here, right? Because if your audience likes you, it's called, image transfer, right? The sponsor knows that if your audience likes you, the audience is going to like your sponsor.
Awesome.
So
okay,
the more,
good idea. I never would have thought of that. Thank you.
yeah. So the more you have social, some people call it social proof. Sometimes there are case studies around this, but the more you can demonstrate the impact of what you do directly through testimonials and quotes. And by the way, if you use people's names, if you use their likeness, you need to get a release and permission to do that. But again, they probably are okay with it because they posted their reviews of
It's
you.
on a public forum.
But here's the thing. If it's somebody who left a review on Spotify, I can't contact that person. So that just means I can't use their name. I can use their quote, right?
Yeah, you can use their quote, and potentially if they use a pseudonym or, Layla A, potentially if they put it on Spotify, I think it would be fair game for you guys.
Okay, yeah. I mean, because it's just, there's no way for us to be able to contact them to get that information. And I don't want to do something illegal.
Yeah, no. That's great. The other thing that's not in here that you kind of
Quick
allude
question
to it.
before you move
Yeah.
to the next one.
Kendall.
Where in the deck should those third-party validations go? After the data? So go data and then validation?
Yeah, you want it more towards the front because you don't want to bury it in the back because again, people may never get to the back. So the further up front, the better. Sometimes I see people pepper that on the front page.
Okay.
Right. So
put it in a couple of places then.
Yeah. I mean, that couldn't hurt. I mean, the more love, the better. Right. So final thing, you kind of allude to it. And I think that the important thing about the sponsorship process and perspective is your ability to customize based on the unique problem of your sponsor. So anywhere in the deck where you talk about the fact that you can customize a solution, and again, that's why I usually tell people, again, when I said it doesn't really apply to you guys, but I really say, hey, try to avoid the three, gold, silver, gold, and bronze, silver, gold, and platinum, that kind of thing, is express the ability to customize. Because if you can get creative and really solve a sponsor's problem, they'll pay you a lot to help do that.
Okay.
So there you go. That completes the diagnosis of the deck of Philanthropy United. You guys have any other questions?
I'm just taking a few notes. There's so much here. I'm like really excited about this.
Does it make sense to somewhere put all the logos where it is or a link for them to go to it?
Sure. If you are available on multiple platforms, again, having as much contact information and provide context, because to the extent that a sponsor is interested, like, again, this is the beginning of the conversation.
Right.
If they're interested, now they're going to dig about you. So if you put all the places you're at, they can listen to you. And if you put your URL, they're going to, go to your website. So logos of places where you're available, all that, Kendall, I think, yes, that would be great to add.
Thank you so much, Ken. We appreciate this so much. We can't wait to redo this entire thing and secure some great sponsors.
You're welcome, Layla. And so to the extent that people want to find you, where can they find you?
www.philanthropyunited.com. If you're interested in just listening to our podcast, you can go to philanthropyunited.com/podcast. You can also search for us on Spotify, Philanthropy United, on iTunes, on Amazon Music, Audible, all the places that podcasts are delivered. And then season 3 will be returning to YouTube. But right now I would not send you there because season 3 has not launched yet.
Okay. Well, that's fantastic. So thank you again to everybody who's stayed to be a part of the inaugural episode of Deck Diagnosis. I'd recommend you going to the Philanthropy United podcast. I was on it. I can tell you that it's a great, great podcast.
We had a good conversation.
Yay!
If you want more free advice from Ken, head over to that episode. It's so good.
And if you're interested in being a guest of Deck Diagnosis, go to www.deckdiagnosis.com and fill our online guest questionnaire. Thank you. And Sponsorship Nation, Deck Diagnosis out.